What happens when a future king finally reaches his breaking point? What happens when years of silence, restraint, and royal politeness collide head-on with a moment so provocative, so emotionally charged, that Prince William can no longer look the other way? What happens when Meghan Markle once again steps into the shadow of Princess Diana? Not subtly, not accidentally, but in a way that forces the entire world to ask the question William feared most. Is Diana's legacy being copied, borrowed, or outright exploited? And perhaps the real question simmering beneath the headlines is this: why did this moment push William into making the boldest, most dramatic, and arguably the most emotionally loaded decision of his entire public life? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. You can feel it already, can't you? The tension, the unspoken resentment, the swirling emotions that have been building quietly, slowly, almost invisibly, until suddenly, they aren't invisible at all. Suddenly, they explode into a firestorm. Because this isn't just another royal disagreement. This isn't another tabloid cycle. This isn't another episode of Sussex versus Wales. This is personal. And when something becomes personal for Prince William, it becomes unstoppable. Think about it. For years, William tolerated the noise, the interviews, the accusations, the documentaries, the rumors, the carefully staged photo ops, the timing of certain releases, the wardrobe choices that fueled debate. He tolerated the constant narrative tug-of-war over Princess Diana's image, over her memory, over her symbolism. But something shifted, something sharp, something visceral, when Meghan stepped out in another moment critics instantly labeled Diana cosplay. Another dress, another silhouette, another emotional expression tied unmistakably to Diana's most iconic images. And whether Meghan meant it or not, the world had only one interpretation. She was invoking Diana again. But here's the twist you didn't expect. William didn't view this as a coincidence. Not this time. Not anymore. Imagine the inside of Kensington Palace on that day. Advisors whispering behind closed doors. Phones buzzing nonstop. Catherine watching William, knowing exactly what was going through his mind without either of them needing to speak. The tension rising with every new headline. The photos plastered everywhere. The comment sections exploding. And the quiet, painful reality William could no longer avoid. Every time Meghan invoked Diana's style, Diana's vulnerability, Diana's tragedy, the world compared the Sussexes to the woman William still mourns. The woman he still protects. The woman whose legacy he considers sacred. And that brings us to the first emotional fault line in this story. Because for William, this wasn't about fashion. This wasn't about PR. This wasn't about Meghan herself. This was about his mother. The mother he lost. The mother whose image, for him, is not a brand, not a symbol, not a storyline, but a wound. A memory. A heartbeat frozen in time. Let me ask you something directly. If someone kept invoking the memory of the person you lost, the person who shaped you, the person who still defines who you are, wouldn't you eventually reach your breaking point too? How long could you endure silently? How long could you watch it unfold before stepping up, and saying enough is enough? Because that is exactly what William did. Not with a tweet, not with a snide comment, not with a public attack. No. William responded like someone who had been pushed repeatedly into a corner, and finally decided to step out with purpose, dignity, and a clear message. He made a decision. A fatal one for family relations. A monumental one for royal dynamics. And a decision Meghan and Harry never imagined he would dare to make. He announced a new Princess Diana tribute project. A project the world had been waiting for. A project that would define Diana's legacy for generations. But here's the shocker. Harry and Meghan weren't invited. Not mentioned. Not included. Not consulted. They were cut out entirely, deliberately, explicitly, and without apology. And this is where the story deepens. Because William didn't simply exclude them. He did something even more provocative. He built a project that honors Diana with absolute reverence, with deep emotional truth, with global significance. And he structured it in a way that makes any future Diana-themed branding by Meghan and Harry look hollow, superficial, and painfully out of place. That's the part almost no one sees at first. Let's zoom out for a moment to understand the weight of this. William has spent his entire adult life protecting Diana's memory. He rarely speaks about her publicly. He guards her private possessions. He shields her legacy from being distorted. And unlike Harry, who shares personal reflections of Diana freely, William carries that pain quietly, protectively, almost fiercely. It's the kind of grief that sits behind his eyes. The kind of grief he doesn't articulate because he doesn't have to. The kind of grief that makes him hypervigilant about anyone leveraging Diana for influence, attention, or sympathy. So when Meghan's latest Diana-themed moment exploded online, it wasn't just a story. It wasn't just a fashion analysis. It wasn't just an accidental coincidence. It was another spark in a pile of emotional dynamite that had been growing since 2018. And you, as the audience, need to remember this. Every royal decision is carefully measured. Nothing is impulsive. Nothing is purely emotional. Everything is filtered through advisors, protocol, and long-term impact. So for William to take a public step that essentially says, "You are not welcome in this tribute," means something seismic happened behind the scenes. It means a line wasn't just crossed, it was obliterated. It means William no longer believes inclusion is possible. It means the rift is deeper than the public was led to believe. But let's be brutally honest here, because the audience deserves the truth. William's decision wasn't just about what Meghan did. It was about what she has been doing consistently, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Invoking Diana's iconography in a way that stirs global attention and revives the monomyth of Diana's tragedy. And the contradiction at the center of this entire drama is this. Meghan positions herself as someone harmed by the royal system, just like Diana. Yet William sees her actions as someone using Diana as a narrative shield. And that creates emotional chaos that no advisor can solve. Let me ask you directly again. What would you do if someone repeatedly invoked the most painful part of your life, your childhood trauma, your personal grief, and the world rewarded them for it? How would you react if those moments reshaped your mother's memory in ways that never aligned with the truth you lived? What William felt in that moment was beyond irritation. It was violation. It was exhaustion. It was grief resurfaced after years of trying to heal. And yet, there's more. Because according to insiders, that moment wasn't even the real catalyst. Something else happened. Something we're about to uncover. Something private. Something that changed everything. A leak. A conversation. A piece of information that reached William at the worst possible moment, and the most impactful one. Because when that leak landed on William's desk, the decision he had been avoiding for years suddenly became unavoidable. It wasn't a matter of preference anymore. It was a matter of integrity. And that is when the idea of a new Diana tribute crystallized in his mind. Not a documentary, not a PR campaign, not a symbolic gesture, but a monumental, global, historical project that honors Diana's humanitarian legacy without distortion, without exploitation, without reinterpretation. A project rooted in sincerity, emotional truth, and deep reverence. But make no mistake, William knew exactly what excluding Harry and Meghan would trigger. Media uproar, public debate, accusations of retaliation, speculation about motives, questions about whether the brothers could ever reconcile. He knew every headline that would follow, and he did it anyway, because at some point, you stop worrying about public perception and start protecting what truly matters. And for William, nothing matters more than Diana's memory, not even royal optics. So here we are, standing at the edge of one of the most important decisions William has ever made. A decision that reshapes the royal family's internal dynamic. A decision that sends an undeniable message across the world. A decision that draws a boundary so clear, so sharp, so aggressively final that even seasoned royal commentators were left stunned. And you might think this story ends here. But it doesn't. This is only the beginning. Because what William does next shocks even his closest advisors. What Harry does next stuns Montecito. And what Meghan does next turns this entire situation into a global spectacle that neither side can escape. And all of it, every twist, every emotional beat, every strategic move, unfolds because of that one moment when William finally said enough is enough. But what exactly was in that leak? What did William see or hear that forced him to take a step this dramatic? And why did Meghan's latest Diana moment hit so differently compared to all the ones before? Those answers reveal the true heart of this story. And what comes next will change everything. and no one saw it coming? What if the moment that finally pushed Prince William over the edge wasn't a headline, wasn't an interview, wasn't a documentary, but a photograph? What if it was a single image of Meghan Markle, dressed in a way the world instantly recognized, styled in a way no one could ignore, posing in a way that made decades-old emotions resurface like a tidal wave? What if the moment that altered the course of the monarchy began not with a scandal, but with a silhouette? Because that's exactly how it started. With a picture. A picture that rippled through social media like an electric shock. A picture that didn't just spark conversation, it detonated it. A picture critics immediately labeled as the latest Diana cosplay. But this time, the reaction was so loud, so widespread, so emotionally loaded that Kensington Palace couldn't pretend not to notice. And William? He noticed immediately. Let's paint the scene in slow motion, because context matters here. Meghan steps out wearing an outfit that mirrors one of Diana's most iconic ensembles. Perhaps the oversized white blouse tucked loosely into tailored pants. Perhaps the black sheep sweater style reimagined in modern knit. Perhaps the bold red and purple color block coat Diana wore in the 90s. Whatever the specific choice, one thing was unmistakably clear: it wasn't subtle. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't accidental. You don't accidentally echo Diana's defining looks, especially when you know the world watches every stitch, every angle, every color, every metaphor. And it wasn't just the clothes. It was the posture, the expression, the gentle tilt of her head, the softness of her gaze, the deliberate callback to vulnerability. The photography style even matched Diana's classic humanitarian-era photos: soft lighting, humanitarian backdrop, symbolic framing. The kind of imagery royal watchers recognize instantly, because Diana didn't just define an aesthetic, she defined an entire emotional language through camera lenses. So when Meghan replicated that visual grammar, intentionally or not, the world didn't see an outfit. They saw a reenactment. They saw a resemblance. They saw symbolism. But the real question is, what did William see? He saw his mother's memory being stirred up again. He saw his mother becoming a backdrop for someone else's narrative. He saw history being mirrored in a way he couldn't control. And here's where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. On one hand, some people praised Meghan. They argued she was honoring Diana. They argued she was keeping Diana's spirit alive. They argued the resemblance was flattering, gentle, inspired. But on the other hand, and this is where the emotional tension explodes, many felt the opposite. They said it was manipulative. They said it was symbolic appropriation. They said it was emotional branding. They said it was a calculated attempt to evoke Diana's vulnerability while positioning Meghan in the same emotional storyline. And that's the part William couldn't ignore anymore. Because for William, this wasn't about PR. It wasn't about fashion. It wasn't about whether Meghan meant well or meant harm. It was about grief and memory and the deep emotional wound of losing his mother in the most public, traumatic way imaginable. Let me ask you this directly. What would you do if someone repeatedly evoked the image of the person whose death reshaped your entire life? If someone kept echoing your mother's most iconic moments, her style, her composure, her humanitarian presence, how long would you be able to sit quietly and pretend it didn't affect you? That's the unseen emotional storm behind this chapter. Because as the photos circulated online, as headlines exploded, as Twitter threads spiraled into chaos, the palace itself began to vibrate with tension. You could practically hear the wheels turning behind the scenes. Advisors trying to stay calm. Social media teams tracking trends. Communications secretaries whispering to one another. And above them all, at the very center of the storm, was William, looking at that photograph with a look equal parts disbelief and exhaustion. Inside palace walls, the reactions varied sharply. Some aides rolled their eyes, dismissing it as another media cycle. Others panicked, sensing public opinion shifting again. Some insisted Meghan must have meant no harm. Others whispered that it was intentional. No one had a unified answer. But William's reaction wasn't mixed. It wasn't divided. It wasn't uncertain. His reaction was immediate. And it was emotional. Because William didn't see an outfit. He didn't see a PR stunt. He didn't see harmless homage. He saw his mother being used as a soft focus shield. He saw Diana being turned into a narrative prop. He saw the past he'd worked so hard to heal being dragged back into the present again. And yet, here's the twist. He didn't lash out. He didn't yell. He didn't explode. He didn't call advisors into an emergency meeting. He went quiet. And anyone who understands William knows that his silence isn't calm. It's focused. It's heavy. It's the kind of silence that comes before a turning point. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the reaction was explosive. Royal commentators dissected the photos like forensic experts. Styling experts compared the cuts, fabrics, and colors to archived Diana images. American media spun the story as an emotional tribute. British tabloids spun it as strategic provocation. Social media became a battlefield. Some called Meghan courageous. Some called her manipulative. Some said she was reclaiming Diana's spirit. Some said she was exploiting Diana's tragedy. And the worst part for William was this recurring theme. People kept comparing Meghan to Diana as if Meghan were the successor to her legacy, a legacy William feels responsible for. Think about how that must feel. To see your mother's life and death become a storyline. To see the woman you lost being used as symbolism. To see your own connection to Diana overshadowed by someone who never met her. And here's the deeper emotional contradiction that fuels this story. Harry embraces the parallel. Harry openly talks about Diana's influence on Meghan. Harry genuinely believes his mother would have loved her. Harry leans into that connection as part of his healing journey. But William? William recoils from it. Because for William, Diana was mother first, icon second. Her memory is personal, not PR. Her legacy is sacred, not brandyable. This is why the photo hit him like a punch. Because Meghan's resemblance to Diana isn't new. But this time the world framed it as proof that Meghan is the new Diana archetype, as if Diana's emotional legacy belonged to Meghan more than to her own sons. And that's when the real explosion happens. Because at the height of all this chaos, something changed. You could feel the shift like a drop in atmospheric pressure. A silence in the room. A moment where everyone in Kensington Palace knew William wasn't just upset. He was done. And that's when the internal fire began building. The kind that doesn't erupt quickly, but slowly, quietly, strategically, powerfully. The fire that leads to action, not anger. But before William made any move, something else happened. Something behind the scenes. Something that made the situation far more emotionally complicated. Something no advisor could have predicted. A phone buzzed. A message appeared. A piece of information landed on William's desk. A leak. A briefing. A confidential detail that pushed him over a line he'd spent years trying not to cross. It wasn't the photo alone. It wasn't Meghan alone. It wasn't the public conversation alone. It was this new information, something private, something strategic, something the world hasn't seen yet, that transformed William's frustration into decisive action. And the moment he heard it, the moment he understood its implications, the idea struck him with absolute clarity. Diana deserves a tribute without chaos, without PR noise, without narrative hijacking, without comparisons, without appropriation, without drama, without the Sussexes. And that was the moment the new Diana project was born. A project rooted not in revenge, but in protection, not in anger, but in love, not in competition, but in legacy preservation. But before anyone knew what William was building, before Catherine spoke up, before advisors strategized, before Harry even learned what was happening, the world was still fixated on that one photograph. The photograph that triggered the biggest royal decision since Harry and Meghan left the monarchy. And as the British public argued, and American commentators speculated, and social media ignited into cultural warfare, William was quietly preparing to unleash a project that would send shockwaves across both continents. But the part that no one outside the palace knew, not yet, at least, was this. Someone inside the family wasn't going to stay silent. Someone inside the palace wasn't going to approve quietly. Someone connected to the Sussexes wasn't going to let this go without a fight. And that someone would make the first move. But what did William see in that leak? Who sent it? And why did it electrify him into action instead of restraint? The truth behind that moment. The trigger that transformed a reaction into a decision is deeper, darker, and more explosive than the public realizes. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What did Prince William say behind closed doors the moment that photo reached him? The moment the world exploded with comparisons. The moment Meghan's latest Diana look triggered a global frenzy. What words came out of him in the private safety of Kensington Palace, when there were no cameras, no reporters, no advisors sanitizing his reactions? What does a future king sound like when the emotional dam finally cracks? Not in public, not in an interview, but in the privacy of his own home, surrounded by people who have seen him at his strongest and his most wounded. Let's step into that room together. Because the inside of Kensington Palace that day didn't feel like a royal residence. It felt like a pressure cooker, a storm shelter, a place where the emotional temperature rose degree by degree with every new notification, every trending hashtag, every journalist demanding a quote, every commentator insisting that Meghan had successfully channeled Diana's spirit, every outlet placing Meghan and Diana side by side, as if the two women lived parallel lives William himself could not untangle. And when William finally walked into the private study, the same room he often uses for quiet briefings, the room filled with photographs of his mother, his family, his childhood memories carefully placed on shelves, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Staff members paused mid-sentence. Advisors exchanged glances. Everyone could sense it. Something was different. William wasn't just frustrated. He wasn't just tired. He wasn't just fed up with yet another news cycle. He was at the point where silence hurts more than speaking. He didn't shout. That's the part people always get wrong about William. He doesn't explode when he's upset. He compresses. He tightens. He sharpens. His voice gets low, deliberate, precise. And that's exactly what happened. He placed the printed photo on the desk. A printout, because William prefers to evaluate things physically, not on a screen, and he stared at it with the kind of expression that reveals more emotion than any outburst could. Catherine watched him from across the room, reading him like a book she'd memorized years ago. And the first words he said were simple, quiet, devastating. Not again. 2 words. Soft, but heavy. Words that carried years of frustration, emotional fatigue, and simmering resentment. Words that echoed every time Meghan's styling choices created yet another Diana comparison online. And it wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something deeper, something raw. Something that came from a place no royal advisor can manage or soften. Because here's the truth. William still dreams about Diana, still hears her voice in certain songs, still feels her presence in the quiet moments, still misses her. And when that photo landed on his desk, that photo critics claimed was inspired by or paying homage to Diana, it wasn't just nostalgia. It was intrusion. And the people in that room knew it instantly. One of William's senior advisors tried to speak, tried to gently introduce the trending headlines, the public statements pouring in, the context behind the image. But William raised a hand, not aggressively, not rudely, just firmly enough to signal that he didn't want explanations. He didn't want interpretations. He didn't want PR spin. He didn't want quotes from fashion analysts telling him why Meghan's look was symbolic and healing. What he wanted was honesty, ground truth, emotional clarity. And that's exactly what Catherine provided. Because she moved toward him with that calm, steady presence that has anchored him through scandals, tensions, grief, and global pressures. And while the advisors stood in cautious silence, Catherine spoke quietly, intentionally, with a tone only William could truly interpret. She said, "This isn't fair to you." And that's the moment everything changed. Because Catherine wasn't talking about Meghan. She wasn't talking about the media. She wasn't talking about public perception. She was talking about William's heart. About the emotional burden he carries every time someone resurrects Diana's image in ways he cannot control, in ways that feel personal, in ways that trigger memories he hasn't fully healed from. Let me ask you directly. How would you feel if the world kept putting a spotlight on your greatest loss? How would you react if someone you had conflict with kept echoing the image of a person whose absence still defines your life? Would you stay quiet forever? Would you keep pretending it didn't sting? William couldn't pretend anymore. But here's the twist. He didn't break down. He didn't snap. He didn't collapse into emotional vulnerability. Instead, something inside him hardened. Not in a cold way, in a determined way. The way someone feels when they decide the line has been crossed too many times. And that's when he said the second sentence that changed the entire energy in the room. This has to stop. Not said with anger. Said with finality. Said with resolve. Said with the weight of someone who has reached a point of no return. And the advisors exchanged nervous glances, because when a future king says something has to stop, it rarely means a casual objection. It means policy. It means action. It means a shift in royal behavior. But before any advisor could ask what he meant or propose strategies, something else happened. Something small, but powerful enough to alter William's timeline. His private secretary stepped forward with a piece of information. A document. A message. Something that had arrived minutes earlier but had not yet been shared. Something that connected directly to the photograph, but in a way far more troublesome than anyone expected. And when William read it, his expression changed again, not into anger, not into pain, but into something colder. Focused. Calculated. A look people inside the palace hadn't seen in a long time. Because the document wasn't just commentary about Meghan's outfit. It wasn't a trending analysis. It wasn't a journalist's speculation. It was internal. It was confidential. And it revealed something about the timing, the styling choices, and the media coordination around Meghan's appearance that suggested intention. Strategy. Deliberate shaping of narrative. It wasn't proof, but it was enough. Enough to confirm William's suspicion that Diana's legacy wasn't being honored, it was being leveraged. And that was the moment everything inside Kensington Palace shifted. Advisors straightened. Catherine's eyes narrowed with recognition. And William set the document down slowly, deliberately, like someone placing the final piece of a puzzle into place. He turned to his team and said something no one expected. "We're done entertaining this." That sentence sent a ripple through the room, because it wasn't just a comment. It was a declaration, a royal directive, a turning point. And William didn't stop there. He continued, voice steady, tone controlled, expression unreadable. "We need to reclaim my mother's legacy. We need to do it properly. We need to do it without noise." Silence fell like a curtain, because everyone knew what he was saying and what he was not saying. He was not going to criticize Meghan publicly. He was not going to start a feud in the press. He was not going to engage in the media circus. He was not going to launch a counterattack. He was going to build something. Something powerful. Something lasting. Something that reshaped the narrative so strongly that no amount of Diana-themed styling from Meghan could overshadow it. But before advisors could ask what he meant, William added the final sentence that clarified everything. And this time, it won't involve Harry. It won't involve Meghan. Not at all. That was the moment Kensington Palace understood. William wasn't reacting emotionally. He was planning strategically. He wasn't lashing out. He was drawing boundaries. He wasn't competing with Meghan. He was protecting Diana. And Catherine? She understood exactly what this meant. She stepped closer and placed her hand on his arm, not in comfort, but in solidarity. Because she knew this wasn't just about public image. It was about William finally standing up for his mother after years of trying to avoid conflict. But the advisors were still uneasy. Cutting Harry out of anything related to Diana felt risky, emotional, potentially damaging to public opinion. But William's tone made it clear. This wasn't negotiable. He said, "This is my mother's legacy. It deserves clarity." And that was that. But just as the room absorbed the weight of William's decision, one advisor spoke up, quietly, cautiously. "Sir, there's something else you should know." William turned, eyebrows tightening just slightly. "What?" And that's when the advisor revealed something that made the entire plan far more complicated and far more urgent. Something connected to Meghan. Something connected to Harry. Something that threatened to twist Diana's legacy even further if William didn't act immediately. Something that made his upcoming decision not just emotional, but necessary. Something that made him say, "Then we move forward now." But what was that confidential information? What did William learn that intensified his resolve? And why did it make the Diana tribute project suddenly impossible to delay? Those answers reveal the true spark that ignited the next phase of the story. And what came next would transform William's frustration into full-scale action, and no one saw it coming. What was in that confidential message that changed everything? What detail was so alarming, so perfectly timed, so emotionally explosive that it shifted Prince William from frustrated to decisive in a matter of seconds? What could possibly have pushed a future king to stop hesitating and finally say, "We move forward now"? Because here's the truth the public never sees. Royal decisions don't hinge on one emotion, one headline, one one photograph. They hinge on patterns, confirmations, context. And this leak, this unexpected briefing that landed in William's hands just minutes after the Meghan photo went viral, was the missing puzzle piece. The detail that transformed suspicion into certainty. The spark that ignited the fuse. Now imagine the scene again. The photograph on William's desk, Catherine standing quietly near him, advisors in a stunned semicircle, everyone sensing the emotional atmosphere thickening by the second. And then the private secretary steps forward, holding a single black folder, one that had been marked urgent, confidential, not to be emailed, not to be forwarded. The kind of folder that does not appear often, but when it does, it matters. William opens it, reads the first sentence, and everything changes. Let's talk about what he saw, piece by piece. Because according to insiders, it wasn't one revelation. It was a chain of them, details small enough to be overlooked individually, but together, they formed a picture William could not ignore. A picture that suggested the Meghan-Diana echo moment wasn't spontaneous, but planned. Media coordination, strategic timing, leaked talking points circulating within certain outlets. A scheduled interview segment in an American media show referencing Diana parallels in advance. A PR consultant's pitch offering analysis on Meghan's channeling of Diana's humanitarian spirit. And worst of all, internal chatter among a few industry professionals speculating that this was part of a broader narrative repositioning timed to an upcoming Sussex project. In other words, the Diana imagery wasn't accidental. It was part of a storyline. Think about how powerful that realization must have been for William. Meghan wasn't just being compared to Diana. She was being positioned as her modern successor. Media outlets were being prepped to receive that narrative. Stylists were analyzing the parallels in advance. Commentators were ready with pre-written tweets. Producers had already shaped talking points for morning shows. This wasn't coincidence. This was orchestration, a campaign, a branding arc. And William wasn't angry because it was clever. He was angry because it was Diana, his mother, his grief, his memory, his loss, being turned into a rollout. You have to imagine his mind in that moment. The emotional weight mixing with strategic clarity. The contradiction of being a public figure whose private pain is constantly used for public consumption. The feeling of being trapped between needing to protect his mother's legacy and needing to maintain royal diplomacy. Let me ask you directly, wouldn't this be the point where your patience snaps? Wouldn't this be the moment where you stop pretending everything is fine? Wouldn't this be the time you finally say enough? Because for William, this wasn't about Meghan's outfit anymore. It wasn't even about Meghan herself. It was about boundaries, respect, agency. It was about the memory of a woman he loved being used for narratives he neither approved nor participated in. He read the document slowly, deliberately, coldly. Catherine watched his face stiffen. Advisors shifted uncomfortably. The room went silent. And then William said, "So that's what this really is." Not shouted, not emotional, not reactionary, just recognition and resolve. The report continued, outlining how the moment had been positioned to align with an anniversary linked to Diana's charity work. It also connected timing patterns between Sussex media moves and certain cultural cycles. And then came the final piece. The one that made William's eyes narrow sharply. It wasn't just about Meghan echoing Diana. Someone had floated a rumor to a journalist suggesting that Diana would have supported Meghan over the royal establishment, framing Meghan not as a modern Diana, but as the rightful heir to her emotional throne. And that was the moment William's restraint ended. You have to understand how deeply that message cuts. Not politically, not publicly, emotionally. William lost more than a mother. He lost a shield, a guide, a source of unconditional love. To see her memory used not as a tribute, but as a weapon against him, that was unacceptable. This is where William's emotional armor cracked, not outwardly, but inwardly, in a way that made his next decision inevitable. He said, "This ends now." Advisors exchanged glances, unsure whether this meant the Diana comparisons, the Sussex narrative control, or the quiet war over public sympathy. But William clarified instantly. "We protect her legacy. We do it properly. We do it without interference." He didn't need to mention Harry and Meghan by name. The implication was clear. And now comes the part that changed everything. Because moments after William declared his intention, another advisor stepped forward with a second update, one that made the situation even more urgent. American producers had reached out requesting Harry and Meghan's participation in a Diana-themed documentary segment that was still in development. Let that sink in. Before William could even announce his own tribute project, before he could protect Diana's legacy the way he always wanted, the Sussexes were already being eyed as narrative anchors for a separate project focusing on Diana's humanitarian impact. If both projects emerged around the same time, the public narrative would inevitably merge them, confuse them, interpret them as rival tributes. Or worse, frame Meghan as the emotional successor to Diana's legacy while depicting William as the institutional heir. This was the nightmare scenario for William, not because he didn't want Harry to honor their mother, but because he did not trust the external forces shaping the Sussex media storylines. And that's when the final straw broke. William realized his mother's legacy was drifting out of his hands, being reshaped, being reinterpreted, being rebranded. Unless he acted now, you could feel the shift in the room, the instant stabilization of William's posture, the straightening of his shoulders, the tightening of his jaw. It wasn't anger driving him anymore. It was purpose. He turned to his private secretary and asked, "How soon can we begin?" The advisor hesitated, unsure if William meant planning, strategizing, or announcing. William clarified, "The Diana Project. All of it. Start the calls. Today." And that declaration altered the course of royal events permanently. Because for the first time in years, William wasn't avoiding the conflict. He wasn't trying to maintain peace. He wasn't walking on eggshells around the Sussex media storm. He was reclaiming what he believed belonged to him, to his mother, to his children, to history. And as the team scrambled to begin the initial drafting, the next surprise came, one no one expected. A quiet knock at the door. A senior advisor stepped in, and what he said made Catherine's breath tighten, and William's expression sharpen even further. "Sir, it appears Meghan's team is preparing a follow-up moment." A follow-up? Yes. Another appearance. Another Diana-coded moment. Sooner than expected. William's tone dropped to a low, dangerous calm. "Then we don't wait." And with that final sentence, the path forward crystallized, not just for William, but for the entire monarchy. The Diana Project would happen. It would be monumental. It would be historically rooted. And it would exclude Harry and Meghan entirely, by necessity, not pettiness. But before William could reveal any details, another twist was already unfolding across the Atlantic. Someone in California had learned about his decision, and they were preparing a response. What was the follow-up moment Meghan's team was planning? How did the Sussex Circle find out? And why did this single leak escalate into a full-scale royal chess match? The answers pushed the story into its next emotional and dramatic phase, and no one saw it coming. What kind of tribute forces a future king to risk headlines, global scrutiny, and a deepening family rift? What kind of project carries enough emotional weight that Prince William would move faster than royal protocol normally allows, bypassing layers of approval, jumping over diplomatic considerations, and launching into action as if something inside him had woken up, suddenly, sharply, unmistakably? Because that's exactly what happened. The moment he said, "Then we don't wait," the atmosphere in Kensington Palace changed. People stopped whispering. People started moving. And, for the first time in years, William wasn't reacting to the Sussex narrative. He was shaping his own. You need to understand something before we go deeper. William isn't impulsive. He doesn't make emotional decisions in the moment. Everything he does is measured, quiet, strategic. But trauma makes exceptions. And grief, especially grief that never fully healed, can turn restraint into resolve with frightening speed. So when William directed his team to begin the Diana Tribute Project immediately, it wasn't an act of retaliation. It was an act of reclamation. For William, this wasn't about competing with Meghan's imagery. It wasn't about silencing Harry. It wasn't even about the PR optics. It was about taking back his mother's legacy before someone else defined it. And that's where the story of this tribute project begins. Not with strategy, not with politics, not with media planning, but with emotion, with memory, with love, with the image of Diana that William carries in his heart, the real Diana, not the mythologized version, not the media caricature, not the symbol, the mother. Let me ask you directly, Have you ever felt someone you loved slipping away from the public memory? Not because their story was forgotten, but because it was being reshaped, retold, repurposed? That's what William was protecting. That's what he feared losing. Now, let's walk into the next scene. The door closes. Advisors gather around the long wooden table. Catherine steps closer to William, her face calm, but her eyes blazing with quiet support. The senior communications secretary sits down with a notebook already open, and William begins speaking. Not like a prince following protocol, but like a son reclaiming truth. Here's what he says. This project honors her. Not the myth, not the narrative, not the media memory. Her. And in that single sentence, you can hear everything. The ache, the determination, the boundary he's drawing. Advisors immediately begin discussing the framework. Legacy projects, philanthropic structures, potential partners, possible initiatives. But William stops them. Not like this, he says. Not as a PR campaign. Not as a charity brand exercise. We do this the way she lived, with substance, with people, with real impact. It's a powerful contradiction. The world remembers Diana for glamour, the gowns, the interviews, the paparazzi. But William remembers her for things the cameras never captured. Late-night hugs, whispered reassurances, the fierce protectiveness of a mother trying to shield her children from chaos. So the tribute project he envisioned couldn't be superficial. It had to be meaningful. It had to carry weight. It had to reflect the Diana the world never fully knew. And here's where the emotional twist enters, the part that advisors didn't expect. William didn't want the project to focus on grief or tragedy. He wanted it to focus on Diana's humanitarian work, the part of her life Meghan wasn't copying, the part that couldn't be exploited or stylized through fashion, the part that belonged to the real Diana, not the symbol. Because while Meghan mirrored Diana's style, Diana's impact could not be mimicked. Her courage, her empathy, her relentless advocacy, her willingness to touch the untouchable, to comfort the rejected, to challenge stigma, to walk where others refused to walk. That's what William wanted to honor, and that's what he feared the world was forgetting. He looked at his team and asked a simple but potent question. What would she be doing today? Silence. Reflection. Then slow, thoughtful ideas began to emerge. Mental health, children's well-being, homelessness, global humanitarian crises, AIDS/HIV stigma reduction, landmine safety initiatives, modern versions of the causes Diana fought for. And slowly, a vision emerged, a massive, multi-tiered, international project that would directly support and expand on Diana's unfinished work. Not a monument, not a museum, but a living continuation of her legacy. The advisors realized this wasn't just a tribute. This was a movement, one that would involve partnerships with global charities, educational programs, mental health initiatives for children, modernized humanitarian missions, a global awareness campaign connecting Diana's past efforts with present-day needs. And William would lead it all, not through flashy headlines, not through emotional interviews, not through dramatic storytelling, but through action, the kind Diana valued. Now here's where you need to pay close attention, because the next detail is the part that shifts this story from emotional to strategic. As the team drafted the concept, the communications director asked the question no one wanted to be the first to ask. Will Prince Harry and Meghan be included? The room froze. Everyone waited. Everyone knew the possible answers, and the consequences attached to each one. William's reaction was instant. Not angry, not conflicted, not unsure. No. And that single word, spoken so quietly the air barely carried it, changed the direction of the entire project. Why? Because William recognized something the public doesn't always see. Including the Sussexes would inevitably shift the narrative away from Diana's legacy and toward the family conflict. It would become a spectacle, a circus, a media frenzy. It would overshadow Diana's memory instead of protecting it. William didn't want drama. He wanted dignity. And he knew, for the first time, that excluding Harry and Meghan was not spiteful. It was necessary. But even as the advisors recovered from the shock of William's firm boundary, another question lingered unspoken in the air. If Harry wasn't included in the tribute to his own mother, would the world blame William or Meghan? And that's where Catherine spoke up, grounding the room with clarity. It isn't about choosing sides. It's about honoring her properly. And everyone knew she was right. Now fast forward as the planning gears begin turning. Phone calls placed discreetly. Emails marked confidential. Outreach to Diana's longtime charity partners. Quiet consultation with the Spencer family. Logistical mapping of events, campaigns, and initiatives. But here's the twist, the part no advisor foresaw, the part that made this tribute project not just meaningful, but revolutionary. William didn't want the tribute to be centered in London alone. He wanted it global. He wanted it accessible. He wanted it to reflect the scale of Diana's impact. He envisioned a worldwide humanitarian initiative, the largest modern royal charity expansion since Diana herself. Something that would ripple across Europe, Africa, Asia, America, and the Commonwealth. Something that would dwarf any Diana-themed branding or messaging coming out of Montecito. But as planning escalated, something else happened. Something subtle, but powerful enough to shift the palace energy again. News began circulating, quietly, through back channels, that someone in California had caught wind of the tribute project. Someone close to Harry and Meghan. And they weren't pleased. In fact, someone, still unidentified, had already initiated early moves to respond, counter, or possibly even upstage the project before it went public. And that's where this story takes its sharpest turn yet. Because while William was building something rooted in sincerity, someone else was preparing something rooted in strategy. And the collision between the two would reshape everything that followed. But what exactly did the Sussex camp hear? Who leaked the first details of William's plan? And what countermeasure did they begin preparing before William even had time to finalize the project? The tension behind those questions leads directly into the next chapter and the next emotional curve in this royal confrontation. And what came next would deepen the divide in a way no one saw coming. What happens inside a royal household when a future king draws a line so sharp, so unmistakably final, that not even his own brother, the brother he once promised to protect forever, is allowed to cross it? What does that moment feel like when the emotional weight of decades collides with the political reality of the present? And what does it say about how far things have truly fallen when Prince William, the once peacemaker, the once reluctant heir, decides without hesitation that Harry and Meghan will play no role whatsoever in the tribute to the mother they both lost? This chapter begins in the quiet aftermath of Chapter 4, when the palace started moving with unusual urgency, when advisors scrambled to draft proposals, when Diana's former charity partners were contacted discreetly, when planning began before the ink was even dry on internal memos. But beneath that flurry of logistics, something far more personal, far more painful, was happening inside William's heart. Because the decision to exclude Harry wasn't merely strategic, it was emotional. It was necessary. It was inevitable. And yet, it was heartbreaking. Try to picture the moment clearly. William standing near the window of his private office, staring out at the palace grounds, watching the winter trees sway in the wind as if they too were carrying the weight of this decision. Catherine standing a few feet behind him, close enough to support him, but far enough to give him space. Advisors sitting quietly at the table, waiting for clarification, waiting for direction, waiting to understand exactly how far William was willing to go. Because excluding Meghan was one thing, advisors expected that. But excluding Harry? That was an entirely different emotional level. Harry wasn't a distant relative. He wasn't an estranged cousin. He was Diana's son, William's brother. The person he grew up with under the same roof, who mourned with him when their mother died, who walked behind Diana's coffin with him, step for step, heartbreak for heartbreak. So when William finally turned around and said, "This project cannot involve them," it wasn't a political maneuver. It was a survival instinct. Let me ask you a question directly, because it matters. How do you honor someone you loved when the people who constantly invoke that person stir more chaos than comfort? How do you protect a legacy when its meaning is being reshaped by narratives you no longer recognize? How do you separate grief from drama when grief is the very thing being weaponized? That's what William was facing. He wasn't excluding Harry out of spite. He was excluding him because the involvement of the Sussexes would derail everything. The project would become a spectacle, a circus, a battle of optics, a feud disguised as a tribute, and William refused to let that happen. He explained it calmly, logically, painfully. He said, "If they're involved, the focus won't be her. It will be us. It will be the conflict. And everyone in the room knew he was right. Because imagine the headlines. William and Harry reunite for Diana tribute. Tension visible. Meghan's appearance overshadows event. Royal rift takes center stage at Diana ceremony. Who spoke first? Who avoided whom? Body language experts weigh in. The tribute would no longer be about Diana. It would be about drama. And William refused to let Meghan, through intention or accident, become the emotional centerpiece of a tribute to a woman she never met. But beneath the logic, beneath the strategy, beneath the necessity, there was something else William would never admit publicly, but Catherine saw it instantly. It hurt him. This was not the decision of a cold king-in-waiting. This was the decision of a broken son. A son who tried for years to reconcile. A son who tried to understand Harry's pain. A son who reached out over and over again only to be met with interviews, accusations, Netflix episodes, memoirs, and endless commentary from Montecito. A son who realized that family loyalty was no longer mutual. And the tragic irony is this. Harry's pain is tied to Diana too. But Harry expresses it differently, loudly, publicly, emotionally, symbolically, while William processes his privately, internally, almost silently. And that difference has become a fault line. But the advisors in the room that day didn't see the emotional history. They saw the strategic implications. They knew the exclusion would hit the global press like a thunderbolt. They knew royal watchers would demand explanations. They knew the Sussex camp would interpret it as an attack. They knew social media would ignite with debates. Whose tribute is more authentic? Who has the right to represent Diana? Who truly understands her legacy? So one advisor spoke, hesitantly, carefully. Sir, the public may view the exclusion as unkind, as unnecessary. William's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch. He didn't waver. He simply replied, what would be unkind is allowing her legacy to be diluted by noise. That was the moment advisors realized the conversation wasn't open for debate. Still, another advisor pressed gently, not confrontationally, but out of duty. Perhaps the Prince of Wales could reconsider involving Harry in a limited capacity. No. But, sir. No. 2 syllables. Final. Unmovable. And then William added something that revealed the depth of his conviction. This is not a reconciliation project. It's a tribute. Catherine's eyes lowered, the weight of those words sinking in. This wasn't about bridging gaps. This wasn't about healing family fractures. This wasn't about mending relationships. It was about Diana. Just Diana. But here's where the story takes a surprising emotional turn. Because even though William had made his decision, something unexpected happened inside that room. A moment advisors rarely witnessed. He didn't break down. He didn't lash out. He didn't grow cold. He grew honest. He said quietly, almost softly, I need to do this without conflict hanging over it. Without distractions. Without comparisons. And that single admission made everything clear. For William, involving Harry wouldn't just complicate logistics. It would reopen wounds. Wounds he'd worked for decades to manage. Wounds he didn't want bleeding into the tribute meant to honor the woman who shaped him more than anyone else. Then Catherine did something only a spouse can do. She stepped toward him and said, You're doing the right thing. She would want this. And William nodded. But something in his eyes suggested a deeper pain, one he rarely allows himself to acknowledge. Because the decision to exclude Harry wasn't simply about Meghan's influence, or media attention, or narrative control. It was about the realization that the brothers no longer shared the same version of Diana. Harry's Diana was the victimized princess who struggled against the institution. William's Diana was the loving mother who tried to protect her children from the chaos. And those two visions can't coexist in a single tribute project. That's why William drew the line. But as the planning continued, something else happened, something none of them expected. A palace aide rushed into the room with new information. Someone from the Sussex circle had caught wind of William's exclusion, and the reaction coming from Montecito was explosive. Phone calls were being made. PR consultants were reportedly activated. Narrative positioning was being crafted. A media ally was preparing a story angle that would paint the exclusion as cruel, divisive, or even politically motivated. And the worst part? The leak suggested Meghan was already preparing a counter-narrative, one that would frame her as Diana's true emotional successor. This was exactly what William feared, exactly what he hoped to avoid, exactly why the exclusion was necessary. But it also meant something far more dangerous. The Sussex camp knew more than they should, which meant someone in England, someone with proximity, was talking. A leak, a mole, a betrayal. And that single discovery changed the entire landscape. It meant the Diana Tribute Project wasn't just a plan anymore. It was a battlefield. Because now, every move William made would be watched, every draft examined, every conversation monitored, every timing decision scrutinized. And on the other side of the world, Harry and Meghan were preparing their own moves, whether defensive, strategic, or retaliatory. So the question becomes, who leaked the information? What exactly did Meghan learn? And how would the Sussexes respond to being completely shut out of a legacy tied directly to the woman both brothers adored? The answers to those questions push the story into even deeper territory, emotional, political, and explosive. Because what William does next, what Harry does next, what Meghan does next, that's what turns this tribute into a turning point for the monarchy. And what came next didn't just escalate the tension, it detonated it. What did Catherine say that shifted William from determined to absolutely unshakable? What insight did she bring, quietly, calmly, without force or theatrics, that changed the shape of the entire Diana Tribute Project? And why is it always Catherine who steps into these moments with a level of emotional clarity that the public never sees, but the palace relies on more than they'll ever admit? Because here's the truth, Catherine doesn't shout. She doesn't posture. She doesn't dominate conversations. She doesn't insert herself into conflicts just to prove a point. Instead, she listens. She observes. She studies the emotional landscape with the precision of someone who has learned, painfully, patiently, that in this family, the loudest voices are rarely the ones that matter most. And when the storm around William intensified, when advisors raced between rooms, when the Sussex leaks created unexpected turbulence, when Diana's memory felt like the battlefield beneath their feet, Catherine didn't panic. She didn't dramatize. She didn't escalate. She stepped closer, not to take control, not to overshadow William, but to steady him. Let's go back to that moment. The moment right after the palace received word that the Sussex Circle was preparing a counter-narrative. The air in the room thickened. Advisors stiffened. Some began drafting rapid response plans. Others whispered about timing adjustments. And someone suggested, almost mechanically, that perhaps they should delay the announcement until tensions cooled. But Catherine, her face didn't show panic. It showed something else. Recognition. She understood what William was feeling because she's lived beside that grief for years. She knows the quiet way he carries Diana within him. She knows the weight of being constantly compared to a woman who was adored globally. She knows the internal battle of honoring a legacy while being suffocated by its shadow. And she also knows something no advisor can grasp: how deeply William fears losing control of his mother's story. So when William turned to her, not for approval, not for validation, but for grounding, Catherine stepped forward, her voice soft but confident. "This isn't about them," she said. "It's about her." 8 words. Simple, unembellished. But they cut through the chaos instantly. Because that was the heart of the problem. The tribute had become entangled in the Sussex narrative. Meghan's Diana-themed appearances, Harry's emotional interviews, the constant media comparisons, everything had blurred Diana's memory into something chaotic and politicized. Catherine was pulling William back to the core. Diana, her spirit, her work, her legacy, her truth. And for a moment, William's shoulders relaxed. But Catherine wasn't finished, because what she said next struck at the emotional core William had been avoiding, consciously or not. "You can't protect her legacy if you're fighting theirs." That sentence was the pivot, because Catherine saw what William couldn't. He wasn't just planning a tribute. He was accidentally waging a symbolic war against the Sussex narrative. And if he framed the tribute as a counter-palace response to Meghan's Diana imagery, the entire project would collapse under scrutiny. "You honor her by rising above it," Catherine continued, "not by reacting to it." And that's when William exhaled, not in relief, not in resignation, but in understanding. Catherine wasn't asking him to soften his stance. She wasn't asking him to include Harry. She wasn't asking him to consider Meghan's feelings. She wasn't even telling him to back down. She was reminding him that Diana deserves to remain untouched by feud. Let's pause here and ask the audience directly. Isn't it strange how sometimes the quietest person in the room offers the clearest truth? Isn't it fascinating how the person who rarely speaks publicly has the most accurate emotional compass privately? And isn't it ironic that Catherine, often underestimated by commentators, becomes the emotional center of royal decision-making when it matters most? Because that's who she is. A stabilizer, a mirror, a compass. The person William trusts when he can't trust anyone else. Now picture the next moment. William sits down slowly. Catherine sits beside him, not across from him, not in a corner, but beside him, shoulder to shoulder, equal footing, united front. The advisors fall silent, waiting, and Catherine begins laying out the emotional landscape with a clarity that advisors could not grasp. "You're not excluding them from your mother," she said quietly. "You're excluding them from the noise. There's a difference, a massive difference, because this was never about access. It was about alignment." And Catherine saw the distinction immediately.